So we just finished celebrating Simchas Torah, and we're beginning Bereshis this week, so just a little bit on the end of the Torah. Maybe we'll have another time to connect the two. But the Gemara tells us there's an interesting discussion in the Gemara on who wrote the last 8 psukim of the Torah. I mean, at first glance, if it wasn't the Gemara, you'd think it's heresy, apikaris. Like, what do you mean? Torah's Moshe. We know the Rambam tells us the Yud Gimel Ikarim. One of the Aleph Beis is Moshe wrote the Torah. It doesn't say anything that the last 8 psukim were in. In fact, that's the Rambam Shita, that Moshe did write the last 8. But it's a machlokes in the Gemara between Rabbi Yehuda and Rav Shimon on who wrote the last 8 psukim. Why are the last 8 psukim? And how come there's no machlokes over the first 8 psukim? Why is there a dispute over the last 8? So we read at the end of Simchas Torah, the end of V-Zoss HaBracha, Vayama Sham Moshe Eved Hashem. It talks about the death of Moshe Rabbeinu. In fact, that's what they call him, Isha Elokim, when he was alive, and Eved Hashem. The highest compliment you could get is being an Eved Hashem. You know, many people are called up Hagon, HaChassid, and the names of galore, but the ultimate compliment is Eved Hashem, you're the servant of God. So they point out, in fact, it was the obituary of Moshe Rabbeinu. In fact, I think as the story goes, and I think it was a real story, that the person faked his own funeral because he wanted to go and hear the eulogies to see what they're going to say about him. So Moshe Rabbeinu, the question is, Vayom Hashem Moshe, so how could he write about his own death? And if he is, he's lying. If he's alive and writing it, then the Torah is not true. It's mixed kashikra. So that's the machlokes in Gemara in terms of how do you deal with the last 8 psukim. When it says, it talks about, so if you say, so one opinion is Yoshua wrote it, because how could you say Moshe wrote something that wasn't true? And the other opinion says, no, Moshe did write it. It says Moshe Kosei V'dema, but there's something about the last 8 psukim that were different than the rest of the Torah. What was different about the last 8 psukim? So there's different explanations. Rashi just writes that, so Gemara basically writes Kosei V'dema. So the simple pshat they write is it means dema, tears. Moshe wrote the last 8 psukim in tears. And Rashi writes mitoch saro. He realized this is the end. He knew his life was coming to an end. And as the Vilna Gaon and everyone else points out, the opportunity we have in this world for mitzvahs. You don't even notice you're wearing a baguette of tzitzis. You do every second another mitzvah, more reward. Once you pass on, meisim chafshim in mitzvahs. You don't have an opportunity anymore. Whatever you did, you did. You know, as we mentioned in Yizkor, hopefully you have some good descendants who do mitzvahs on your behalf, so then there is still hope for you. But in terms of what you could do for yourself, it's over with. So Moshe was the king of this. That's the Gemara in Sota. It says Moshe was mitztayar, that he couldn't enter the land of Israel. How come? Because he couldn't get any eish tanor shlamers. I don't know, maybe that was true. But the Gemara tells us he was mitztayar because he wanted to fulfill the mitzvahs hatluyas b'aretz. He wanted different mitzvahs he couldn't perform when he wasn't in Israel, Truma, Ma'isa, Shemitah. So the question is, like, what are you getting all worked up on? You're exempt. Like, okay, if you could put on your tefillin, you don't, then you should get worked up about it. But if I can't do the mitzvah of Shemitah now, so what? I can't help it. I'm here. So no, that's the pshat. We learn out the attitude of Moshe Rabbeinu that you should try to put yourself in a situation where you can fulfill as many mitzvahs as possible, and that's really what we do with the mitzvah of tzitzis. Really, technically speaking, if you're not wearing a 4-cornered garment, you're not obligated in the mitzvah of tzitzis. If I'm wearing a 4-cornered garment, so our meaning today is we put ourselves in it used to be a Bisman HaGemara, they had 4-cornered garments. So you walk around with a 4-cornered garment, that's a bit telasi, that's a negative. But today we go out of our way. Most of our clothing are not 4-cornered. We go ahead, we put on the tzitzis so we can do the opportunities. That's what Rashi writes. The tears were mitoch saro, that he realized this is it, his last opportunities in Olam Hazeh to do mitzvahs. The Maharsha has more, he deals with more the issue of mixi kashikra. How could it be that Moshe Rabbeinu is writing the last 8 psukim? So he wants to deal with a little halachically that he wants to point out. We have a concept in Hilchos Shabbos, but by any halacha, any din of ksiva, there's a halacha you need a ksiva miskayemes. Like if you're at the beach and you start going in the sand and writing the names, so that's not a biblical prohibition because the wind, the sand is going to blow back. Or perhaps on the cars when it's like foggy out and people like writing the names. All those different types of writings are considered ksiva. That's why you have the grama pens, as they call them, in different hospitals in Israel. When you have to write things, so if you're going to write, so it's always better to do things that are indirect. And also, you have certain pens, I think after whatever the certain time is, they disappear after that time. And they have it worked out that basically they're not violating the halacha of ksiva, at least in Torah, and then you're only dealing with the Durabanan. So they point out that he wants to deal with the question over here is how can Moshe Rabbeinu write a lie? It's mixi keshikra. So the point is, no, Moshe Rabbeinu didn't write it. He only wrote it in B'dema. He wrote it with tears. So it wasn't something that was lasting. So he really didn't have a din of ksiva. Many people misunderstand the Marsha by saying, oh, as long as I don't say it, it's not a lie. You mean I can write anything I want on my taxes? Your father's an accountant. I'm sure he deals with that all the time. So I thought what the Marsha is saying is Moshe had to write it, so he do it in the most indirect way. Like we have like the Gemara in Sanhedrin in the beginning of the 6th parak, Nigmar Adin, when they had when Yoshua, someone violated the Chayrim by an Achan was the guilty one, and before Yoshua wanted God to tell him, God, I'm not telling you who I am. Figure it out. Do lots. We always, anytime you have to do something, you always prefer in a more indirect fashion. So the Marsha, he's just dealing more with trying to give a halachic reason why Moshe wasn't lying, why he wasn't in Mixi Kashikra, because he didn't have a din of ksiva, and he never actually said it. Because there's two differences. The Gemara says Hashem Omer Umoshe Kosev. The last day Psukim only says Moshe Kosev. So there was no Hashem Omer. So he deals with it more in a halachic vein. And there's a famous trash in the Vilna Gaon. He says B'dama, if it isn't tears, it means like Truma, Dama, if it gets mixed up. He writes, we know we have a famous klal, Elu ve'elu divro kim chayim. We have a general principle that we have many disputes, Beis Hillel, Beis Shammai, or many, to open up a Gemara, you find that there's many disputes on every page. So you'll say, well, Bittul Torah, what are you learning Beis Shammai? Like Beis Shammai we usually reject. Are you wasting it? So, of course, no, you get a mitzvah, you get the same mitzvah of Talmud Torah by learning Beis Shammai as you Beis Hillel. There's one issue of how we paskin lahora, that's one question, but it doesn't mean the other opinions are wrong. All the opinions in the Gemara are valid opinions. So within the box, you have many valid opinions, and when it comes to halacha, you have to have a Rabbi, you have to find out how to psak and how to get a specific psak. So the Vilna Gaon says, really, there's no machlokas. What do you mean there's no machlokas? One person said Moshe wrote the last day Psukim, and one said Yoshua. How could you have any less of a machlokas than that? He says no. He refers us to the Ramban in his Hakdama to Sefer Bereshis. The Ramban tells us, in one of the many things he says as an introduction to Bereshis, he says that really the Torah is Shmosav Shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. If we had the code and we were able to read it, we'd be able to see that Torah, every word, all letters, it's all one continuation, it's all praise, it's all names of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. However, he says that was because the Torah was created before the world. So that's the Torah in its pristine state. The original Torah, that's basically the same way, but doesn't have the same stops, the letters. If we knew how to read it, we'd see straight to Shmos HaShal HaKadosh Baruch Hu. However, when Moshe put it down into print, at Har Sinai, and different opinions in the Gemara, in the Rishonim, whether he wrote everything down then, or as they went along, they added to, whichever derech you take. At the end of the day, Moshe Rabbeinu wrote down in print the Torah we understand today. So therefore, the Vilna Gaon says like this. So, V'kol Torah kulo Hashem Omer u'Moshe Omer v'Kosev, and then God said, and then Moshe said it and wrote it down. So that was for the whole Torah. For the last day Psukim, So how could he write by Yom Hashem Moshe Eved Hashem? He didn't write it. He did write it. He didn't write it. He wrote the Torah in the pristine state. Maybe he understood the code. He was writing Shmos of Shalom Kadosh Baruch Hu. It wasn't, and then later on, Yoshua came along, or whoever, and put in the way we have it today. So that's what the Vilna Gaon says. Elu v'elu, Divrei Kim Chayim. That really they're both right. Moshe wrote the last 8 psukim. He wrote it in the pristine state that the Ramban is talking about, and Yoshua did the last 8 psukim the way he knew it. So we have 3 pshatim. We have. And who wrote the last? What's the pshat in the last day? We have a machokas in the Gemara, whether Moshe or Yoshua. So Rashi just writes he was crying mitoch sorrow because he realized it was the end. And then we have the answer to the Marsha, more of a halachic answer dealing with how could Moshe mix it kashikra. So he never actually said it. He just wrote it, and since he wrote it with tears, so doesn't really have a halachic status of ksiva. And we have the Vilna Gaon, who says, no, Elu ve'elu, Divrei Kim Chai, and they both wrote it. But Moshe wrote it in the pristine state, the way the Ramban writes, and Yoshua finished it off. And just to conclude, so my nafkamina, what's the practical difference? Whether I say Moshe Rabbeinu wrote the last 8 psukim or Yoshua, the bottom line is, the last 8 psukim are still the same last 8 psukim, whichever pshat you want. Is there a nafkamina? Is there a nafkamina whether Moshe Rabbeinu wrote it, or that the fact? Is there a nafkamina the fact that either Yoshua wrote it or Moshe wrote these last 8 psukim different than the rest of the Torah? So that's what the Gemara tells us. Yachid korei osam. There's a halacha. The Gemara says, what's so special about the last 8 psukim you don't need for the rest of the Torah? Yachid korei osam. Literally, a yachid gets to read it. So what's pshat yachid korei osam? So quickly we'll go through those pshatim. So Yachid Korei Osam, or maybe I'll just save. We'll just do the Rambam for now, and we'll save the rest for another time. Because I told Sean only 10 minutes, so you have a couple more minutes. Okay, so I'll squeeze it into 15. So it goes like this. So we have different pshatim. Rashi writes Yachid Korei Osam, that we say, what does it mean? Because usually we have something called Hosafis every Shabbos. The Mishnah tells us in Megillah that for Shabbos we can add Hosafis. Yontiv we don't have Hosafis. Actually, we have 2 exceptions. We have an exception in both directions. When Yontiv, we had them both. When Yontiv falls out on Shabbos, we don't have Hosafis. And when Simchas Torah we just had, is the exception is only Yontiv where we have Hosafis. What's the pshat? Why are those 2 exceptions to the rule? So Rav Soloveitchik explained because it depends, it's the nature of the Kriya. Because on Yontiv Shechal B'Shabbos, we read the Yontiv Dika Kriya. So we read the Yontiv, we go with the dinam of Yontiv. But even though Simchas Torah is a Yontiv, what are we reading? Parashat Shavuot, we're reading V-Zoss HaBracha, so it's a din in the Shabbos Kriya and the Parashat Shavuot, that's why we can have Hosafis. So either way, so Rashi writes is, by the rest of the Torah we can have Hosafis, except for like the Kolas, the Mafzikim B'Kolas. But here, by the last 8 psukim, you can't do Hosafis. In other words, why would you want to? Because that's the big money maker. Chasen Torah, Chasen Bereshis. So I guess it's alluding to the fact, go make your money in some other way, don't break up the last 8 psukim. That's how Rashi learns. Others learn, he quotes from Rabbeinu Meshulam, that it used to be that what?
Wait, so Rashi holds that
they can't break up.
That Yeshua wrote it then?
No, it's either this is explaining either way, whether it's Yoshua wrote the last 8 psukim or Moshe wrote them in a different way. We're asking what's the difference. Do the last 8 psukim have a different status than the rest of the Torah? Whether you want to say it's Yoshua wrote it or Moshe wrote it differently, we want to give some halachic difference. So Rashi says that's the halachic difference. You can't make a Hosafa in the last 8 psukim, you got to read it straight. Rabbeinu Meshulam says it goes back to the original institution. The original institution was you got called up, you read, the one who got called up for the Aliyah was the Baal Koreh. And then of course everyone decided they're not showing up in Shul, they might call on me, so they're not to embarrass the people who can't learn, so we instituted the Baal Koreh. So that's what Rabbeinu Meshulam, but in the last 8 psukim, Yachid Korei, we don't follow this, but That's Rabbi Yachid Korei. You only, instead of having two people up there, Yachid, the person who gets the Aliyah, he should be the one who's laning it. So that's one pshat. Others write Yachid Korei or some Yachid, the Yachid, the Mordechai, the Rav, the Talmud Chacham. He should get Chassan Torah. That's the minhag. You give it to the Rav of the shul. You give it to the Talmud Chacham. It's Yachid, the Yachid. And Rav Soloveitchik has, and the Rambam has a famous pshat, Yachid Korei Osam. Yachid Korei Osam means you don't need a minion. Yachid in contrast to the Tzibor. So what's the pshat? And in fact, the Ravid goes crazy on the Rambam. Echat Tzibor halach. What are you talking about? Where did the Tzibor go? What do you mean? So of course, the Ravid must have been a big kadosh. He didn't realize Simchas Torah. I know where everyone is. They're making kiddush in the back of the shul. They're having the schnapps and cake. I know where they all went. So, but on a serious note, the Ravid's kasha is, so where did the Tzibor go? So obviously he means, where did the din? That's a separate share what the Ravid's asking. But either way, that's his kasha on the Rambam. So Rav Soloveitchik has a famous pshat on the Rambam. What's the pshat? Like, where did the Tzibor go? What is it? What do you mean the Rambam says you don't need a minion for the last 8 psukim? So he says, what's the pshat? Because why do we read Kriyas HaTorah? We read Kriyas HaTorah, Zeichu Kabbalah Sinai. When we read, in general, when the reason why Chazal set up Kriyas HaTorah, besides not going 3 days without Torah, it's a reenactment of Maimon Har Sinai. As the Ramban writes, we have a mitzvah in our Torah, Pen Tishrach, we can never forget that the Torah was given. So when we read Kriyas HaTorah, besides all the other issues, it's Zeicher to Kabbalah Torah and Har Sinai. We always want to remember Maimon Har Sinai. So the Rav says, yes, so that's the pshat. When it came to the whole Torah, what did Moshe do? He gathered all the people together and he taught Klal Yisrael Torah. But what happened in the last 8 psukim? He's going to go around teaching, calling the million Jews. He's not going to teach about his death. So that he went, it was privately, one-on-one, or assuming like the Rambam's working, Moshe did a Moshe Kosei B'dema. So Moshe went around and taught the last 8 psukim privately. He says it fits in beautifully. We read the Kriyas HaTorah, Zecher, the way that Moshe gave the Torah. So Kol HaTorah Kul, he gave it Barabim. But the last 8 psukim, because it talks about the death of Moshe, he only gave it B'Yachid. And that's the Pshat, Yachid Korei. So to summarize, we had the different pshatim with Yachid Korei Osam Rashi. It means that you can't make Hosafish, you can't split it up. You have Rabbeinu Meshulam, you revert back to the old practice, Yachid. The one who gets the Aliyah, he is the one laning. Only one person is laning. You have the Mordechai, the Yachid, the Rav, the Talmud Chacham, he reads from he's the one who gets the Aliyah. And we have the Rambam, Yachid in contrast to Tzibor. The Rabbi said where did the minion go, and that's the Rav explanation. We don't need a minion. The minion the pshat is that the last 8 psukim were given privately, and therefore we always read the Kriyas HaTorah, Zeichel Kabbalah Torah Misinai.